the day Jerusalem stood still. It wasn't because of wars, it wasn't because of Rome, but because of a newborn child. While the world slept, wise men from the east crossed deserts guided by a star. They were searching for a king who, according to the prophecies, would be greater than Caesar, greater than David, greater than any human throne. But there was a problem. Jerusalem already had a king, Herod the Great. What most people don't know is that this man did much more than the massacre of Bethlehem. There is a silence in history, a mystery that crosses generations. Who really was Herod the Great? Why did he become the most feared king of Judea? And what was his true end? Get ready to uncover the hidden truth behind the man who challenged heaven and lost to eternity. Before we dive into this journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the hidden and transformative stories of the Bible. Now then, let's continue. When Rome decides who rules the Holy Land, Matthew 2:1. The desert was not just dry land for Herod. Every grain of sand seemed to whisper a bitter truth. He was not the rightful heir of Judah. The blood of David did not run through his veins. His throne had been bought, not inherited. The walls of Jerusalem in the distance seemed smaller than his ambition. Herod gripped the reins of his horse with a force that betrayed what he carried inside. Fear not of the people, not of Rome, but of something he could never control. The living memory of the promises made by God to the children of Israel. Herod was an Idian, a descendant of Edom, a land cursed by the Jews. Despite his title, he was seen as an impostor, a stranger on David's throne. Rome had placed him there. Yes, the Senate had acclaimed him as king of the Jews. Yes, but he knew that in every alley, in every house, in every synagogue, people whispered that he would never truly be one of them, and that devoured him from within. He paced restlessly through the palace corridors in Jerusalem, the cold marble beneath. His feet brought him no comfort. The Roman soldiers at every door gave him no peace. His eyes darted toward the windows as if he feared news might arrive at any moment. In the council room, his generals waited for him, but Herod delayed the meeting. The latest message from Rome gnawed him. Octavian, now called Caesar Augustus, had ordered a census across all the land. Once again, the people would grow restless. Once again, he would be seen as the tyrant who served the Romans. But there was something more, something he couldn't yet name. He remembered the words of his father Antipater, the man who had taught him that power was not given, but taken. And he had taken it with blood, cunning, and dirty alliances. He had become king, but now he felt something slipping through his fingers. A shadow, something in the air. That day seemed ordinary. The sun burned the sky as always. The priests came and went through the temple. The merchants shouted in the streets. But there was a strange silence, as if time itself was holding its breath. When he finally entered the council room, a Roman messenger stepped forward, sweaty, trembling, holding a scroll sealed with Caesar's emblem. "Speak quickly what you bring," Herod demanded, his voice heavy with tension. The messenger fell to his knees, unrolled a scroll, and read, "Notice from Rome. Men from the east have been seen arriving in Jerusalem. They say they are seeking the king of the Jews who has just been born." The silence was deadly. Herod's heart raced. For a moment it felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "What king? I am the king of the Jews." His voice exploded like thunder. The entire council fell silent, fearing what might happen next. The messenger stammered as he replied, They say they have seen a star, an ancient prophecy." Herod closed his eyes for a moment. The blood boiled in his veins. It wasn't enough to be rejected by the people. Now the heavens seemed to have chosen another. He knew he could not allow another king to be recognized. Even if it was a baby, even if it was a prophecy. The throne was his, and whoever tried to take it would pay with blood. The Edomite who sat on David's throne. The corridors of the palace in Jerusalem carried a heavy silence that night. The torches burned on the stone walls, casting distorted shadows on the polished marble floor. Herod walked alone, feeling the echo of his own footsteps pounding in his ears. It wasn't a night different from the others, but in his heart, he knew something in the air had changed. He stopped before the royal balcony, looking out over the city that seemed to be asleep. But Herod knew that even in silence, Jerusalem never slept completely. Every house, every street, every priest hid a venomous thought against him. Herod knew what they said, that he was a usurper, a foreigner placed on the throne that should belong to the lineage of David. He remembered the old stories. The wars between Israel and Edom, the centuries of hatred between the two peoples. He was an Idian, a son of Esau, and would never be accepted by the sons of Jacob. But he hadn't come that far to be loved. He had come to rule, to win, to reign, and no matter the cost. Herod gripped the balcony tightly. The cold wind of the night brought to his mind the memory of the day Rome declared him king. He could still hear the acclamation in the Senate, the voices echoing his name as if he were a god. But that glory now felt distant. Rome had crowned him, but Israel rejected him. And every suspicious glance from the priests was like a dagger to his soul already marked by betrayals and murders. He was not naive. He knew that the crown on his head was upheld by blood. He had killed to get there. He had betrayed, deceived, destroyed entire families. He had blood on his hands, and the people knew it. And even so, what tormented him most were not the sins of the past, but the fear of a future he could not control. The prophecies. Since he had taken the throne, He had heard whispers about a promised king, a descendant of David who would come to restore Israel's rightful throne, a child, a deliverer. Herod mocked these stories in public, but in secret they consumed him. He had sent spies to every village, every city, every family that claimed royal descent. He watched the priests, bribed scribes, planted men among the Pharisees. No word escaped Jerusalem without reaching his ears. Miriam, his wife from the priestly lineage, had been his greatest political move. He had taken her as his wife to legitimize his reign in the eyes of the people. But not even her blood was enough to erase the stigma of his origin. And Herod knew it. He saw in her eyes the same distrust he saw in the eyes of the people. There was no true love in that marriage. There was politics, there was fear, and there was a greater fear growing in his chest. The fear that Miriam would give him a son whom the people would consider more legitimate than himself. Herod knew that even in his own house, the throne was threatened. He ran his hands over his face. Exhausted, the years of his reign had brought him riches, power, grand constructions, but none of it filled the emptiness he felt. He had built palaces, fortresses, aqueducts, even a port in Caesarea that impressed Caesar Augustus himself. But the people continued to wait for someone greater, a king who would come from heaven, not from Rome. Herod took a deep breath. He knew he could not lower his guard. Not now, not ever. That same night, the guards brought a messenger, a Roman, breathless, sweaty, carrying a sealed scroll. Herod ordered everyone to leave except the man trembling before him. "Speak," Herod said coldly. The messenger hesitated but handed over the scroll. Herod broke the seal and read in silence. His eyes narrowed. His hands began to sweat. He read it again, twice, 3 times. Strangers had arrived in Jerusalem, wise men from the east, men who claimed to have seen a star. They were looking for a king, a newborn king of the Jews. Herod threw the scroll to the ground, took a deep breath, and clenched his fists. What he feared now had form, had a name, had a star announcing his arrival, and the throne was threatened like never before. We are only at the beginning of a great story. If you want to follow others like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with those who appreciate quality content. Let's pick up right where we left off. The day Jerusalem trembled at the announcement of the Magi. Matthew 2-3. The eastern gate of Jerusalem creaked as it opened at sunrise. At first, a few paid attention, accustomed to merchants and caravans entering and leaving the city every day. But that morning felt different. It was as if the wind carried an invisible warning, as if the very sky was holding its breath. They came mounted on imposing camels, their long robes and golden ornaments shining under the morning light. Men of foreign appearance, faces weathered by the sun, eyes as dark as the night. Magi, wise men from the east. No one knew exactly from which land they had come, but they spoke with the certainty of those who carry a revelation. The first to notice them was an old fabric merchant who watched as they stopped their caravan in the middle of the square. They were not seeking shelter. They were not seeking trade. They were looking for someone. And it wasn't Herod. "Where is the newborn king of the Jews?" they asked aloud to the first people who approached. The merchant turned pale. He quickly turned and whispered to the man beside him. Soon whispers spread like wildfire. "The king of the Jews, a newborn. What are these strangers saying?" People gathered around them trying to understand. Mothers pulled their children close. Men exchanged suspicious glances. The priests watched tensely from the temple steps. That simple question carried a threat. Few dared to say aloud. Fear spread so quickly that in less than an hour all Jerusalem was talking about it. It wasn't just curiosity. It was panic because everyone knew that Herod would hear of it. And when he did, there would be blood. One of the Magi with a long black beard raised his hand in a sign of peace, trying to calm the crowd. With a serene voice, he explained, "We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." The words spoken with reverence sounded like a death sentence over the city, because the only one who called himself King of the Jews sat on a marble throne, and he would not tolerate a rival, much less a baby. The rumor reached the guards. Within minutes they ran to the palace. Herod, still troubled by the message from the night before, was urgently summoned. The Roman messenger had barely finished his report, and now the citizens themselves were bringing confirmation. Herod, dressed in haste, his hands trembled, but his face remained cold as a stone mask. When he entered the throne room, the counselors were already gathered. The captain of the guard stepped forward, hesitant. "Majesty, there are men from the east in the streets. They claim that a king has been born in Israel." Herod clenched his fists at the sound of it. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then forced a cynical smile. "Summon the priests now," he ordered sharply. Minutes later, the chief teachers of the law, the elders and scribes of the temple were brought before the king. They entered in silence, their faces pale as wax. Herod looked at them like a hunter studies his prey before striking. "Tell me, where is the Christ supposed to be born according to the scriptures?" The men glanced at each other, visibly afraid of every word they might speak. The chief scribe, with an almost inaudible voice, replied, "In Bethlehem of Judea. So it is written by the prophets." Herod pressed his lips together. Bethlehem, just a few hours from Jerusalem. Small, forgotten, but now the center of a prophesied threat. He dismissed the priests with a gesture and turned his attention to the Magi who had been secretly brought into the palace. He received them with false smiles, soft words, and a calculating gaze. "Go to Bethlehem, search for this child, and when you find him, return and inform me. I too wish to worship him." But in his heart, Herod had already planned the end of that unknown baby. There would be no other king in Israel, not while he still breathed. When the teachers of the law revealed the Messiah's location, the throne room was empty. When the doors closed behind the priests, Herod remained standing before them, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on every bowed face before him. There was no rush. He wanted them to feel the weight of the waiting, to be crushed by the very silence, before they dared to speak. No one spoke, no one moved. Only the torches crackled on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to grow like monsters around the room. Herod knew exactly what he was doing. Those men, though proud of their knowledge, trembled before the power of Rome, and he was Rome's arm on that throne. They could recite the scriptures with their tongues, but their knees bowed to fear. Finally, Herod took a step forward. His eyes swept over the elders one by one. "You heard the Magi. A king has been born in Israel, and according to the scriptures, where is the Christ to be born?" The chief scribe hesitated, glancing quickly at the others as if seeking support that would not come. His voice came out trembling, almost a whisper, "In Bethlehem of Judea, O king." So the prophets have said. Herod already knew the answer, but hearing it from their mouths made everything more real and more dangerous. He walked slowly to the center of the room like a serpent ready to strike. He stopped before the scribe and slightly tilted his head. "And what else do the prophecies say?" The old man took a deep breath, closing his eyes as if reliving a text memorized since his youth. "That from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Herod clenched his teeth. The ruler, the shepherd. Dangerous words that inflamed the hearts of the people. Words that directly challenged his crown. Herod turned his back and walked toward the throne, clenching his fists until his nails dug into his palms. He sat down slowly, crossed his legs, and tapped his fingers on the armrest of the throne. "You are dismissed." The elders exchanged glances, surprised. No punishment, no threats, no orders. Herod maintained his cold smile. He knew they would leave carrying terror in every step. That was all he needed for now. When the doors closed again, Herod called for his most loyal men, not soldiers, not common guards, but his spies, men trained to move in the shadows. He ordered them to follow the Magi discreetly, to record every step, every word, every gesture. He wanted to know everything, he wanted to see everything, and more than that, he wanted to stay ahead. The king knew he needed a definitive answer, and for that he needed the trust of the Magi. That's why he ordered them to be received with banquets, honors, and gifts, to be deceived into believing they were safe in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Herod watched every movement in the city. No child born in Bethlehem in recent days would escape his radar. No family would be ignored. No cry would go unnoticed. But what troubled Herod's heart the most was the silence of the heavens. There were no thunders, no visible signs, only a star, that cursed star shining over Bethlehem like a silent beacon, as if mocking the iron throne he had built with so much blood. He knew the Magi would leave soon. He knew time was against him, and he knew that once they found the child, it would be impossible to control what would come next. Herod had to act first. He leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the floor, his thoughts boiling like a cauldron about to explode. The Messiah had been located. The city was in panic, and all of Jerusalem knew that the king would not let this pass quietly. Herod pretends to worship but sets a trap. Matthew 2-7. The sun was already beginning to set when Herod ordered the Magi to be brought to him in secret. He didn't want the priests nearby, nor the counselors, not even the Roman officials. That night the throne room would belong to them alone, him and the men from the east. When the Magi entered, they were even more impressive up close. Their robes were fine, embroidered with threads of gold and purple. Their faces were serious, but they carried a brightness in their eyes that Herod could not decipher. They bowed respectfully, but without the reverence the king had expected. Herod received them with carefully calculated smiles. He gestured for them to come closer and dismissed the servants with a subtle wave. He personally closed the doors, ensuring no one else would hear what was about to be said. He walked slowly toward the Magi like a father approaching beloved sons. "I have heard you are seeking the King of the Jews," he said, his voice thick with false emotion. "Tell me, how did you come to know this?" The Magi exchanged quick glances, but the eldest among them, a man with a long beard and eyes marked by time, stepped forward. "A star guided us from the east. It shines brightly, announcing that a king has been born in Israel." Herod kept smiling, but inside his blood boiled. He stepped even closer, almost whispering, "And when did this star first appear?" The Magus answered promptly. "Months ago the sign was clear. We gathered treasures and came to worship him." Herod took a deep breath as if in wonder, but his heart pounded like a war drum. Now he had confirmation of the timing. Months the child was no longer a defenseless newborn. He could already be growing somewhere, gaining strength, surrounded by a people awaiting a deliverer. He turned, pretending to pace in thought, then turned back to them as if sharing a secret. "The priests have told me that the Christ must be born in Bethlehem, a humble village to the south of this city." He paused dramatically, looked at each of them, and added, "Go there, search for him with all the zeal you have shown so far, and when you find him, come back to me, tell me everything, for I too wish to go and worship him." The silence that followed was thick as fog. The Magi, perhaps suspicious, perhaps surprised, nodded respectfully. They had no way of knowing what lurked behind the smile of that man. Herod extended his hands in a gesture of blessing, blessing them as if he were a pious priest. Then he called for the servants, ordering banquets and rest for the foreigners. He did everything he could to convince them that his intentions were pure. But as soon as the doors closed again and the Magi disappeared down the corridors, Herod turned back to his trusted men. His gaze now was pure venom. Follow them. Watch every step. Find out every house they visit, every family they approach. I want to know everything before they even return. The men bowed and left in silence. Herod remained alone for a few minutes, looking at the great table of the throne room. Spread across it were the maps of Judea, the caravan routes, the names of the royal families that still carried Davidic blood. He took a dagger from his belt. His reflection in the blade seemed strange to him, almost foreign. He knew who he was. He knew what needed to be done. There would be no other king. When the Magi left, he would be ready. And when they returned, if they returned, Herod would have already set a net that no child could escape. He rose from the throne for the last time that night, and before leaving the room, he murmured to himself, "May God have mercy, because I will not." The marriage with Mariam and the ghost of betrayal. While the night in Jerusalem stretched on in silence, the king withdrew to his chambers, but sleep did not come. The shadow of the Magi, the star over Bethlehem, and the growing suspicion that his throne hung by a thread consumed every inch of Herod's mind. And there was something, or rather someone, that disturbed him even more. Mariamne. She slept silently on the other side of the room. Her dark hair spilled over her shoulders, her skin pale as alabaster, her expression calm as if indifferent to all the chaos swirling beyond that door. Herod watched her like one watches a sharp blade. He had married her for strategy, not for love, or so he told himself. But there was something about her that unsettled him. Mariamne was the granddaughter of the high priest Hieronymus II, one of the last heirs of the priestly Hasmonean line, the people who by right held the crown he had stolen. Taking her as his wife had been his boldest move to legitimize his throne in the eyes of the people, a move he was beginning to believe had been his greatest mistake. Herod knew the people saw her as the true queen. The eyes of Jerusalem turned to her with respect, and that bothered him. No matter how much he had made her his wife, no matter how many titles and riches he had given her, Herod had never managed to possess her heart. Miriam looked at him with the same coldness with which the walls looked at the desert, unmoved, impassive, distant. She never disguised her contempt, and that infuriated him. Herod walked slowly to the edge of the bed and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees, his head in his hands. How many times had he suspected that she was conspiring against him? How many times had his men brought him rumors that Miriam still dreamed of the return of the priestly rule? He loved her, or at least he thought he did. But more than that, he feared her. He feared that one day she would rally the people against him. He feared that her womb would bear a son who would dethrone him. He feared that her blood was stronger than his own. That is why he kept her under silent watch. Her servants were loyal to him, and every move she made was reported. Even the whispered conversations among her ladies-in-waiting, even the glances she exchanged with her own brothers. Herod knew every detail, every hidden plan. She might not even have the courage to carry out, but which he already punished in his heart. Mariam knew this, and that kept her silent. That night, as he lay down beside her, Herod felt the weight of something he would never admit to anyone. He preferred to have her as an open enemy rather than a silent shadow in his bed. He preferred her to hate him openly than to continue living under the terror of her quiet disdain. He gently touched her shoulder. Mariam opened her eyes slowly, without surprise, without fear. She just looked at him. Her gaze pierced him more deeply than any sword. "You heard, didn't you?" he whispered. She did not reply. "The Magi, a king, has been born." Still, she remained silent. "In Bethlehem," he continued, as if confessing the only weakness he had never dared admit in public. "And you hope he will destroy me, don't you?" Mariam blinked slowly and turned her face to the other side as if refusing to engage in a pointless argument. But that silence was the cruelest answer Herod could receive. He lay on his back, his eyes fixed on the stone ceiling. The throne was threatened out there, but the real enemy was lying beside him. Herod knew it, and what he would do next would destroy what little remained of what he once called love. If this content is meaningful to you, I warmly invite you to subscribe, like, and share. It's a simple gesture that means a lot to us. Now let's return to the story we were following. When the Magi disobeyed the king, Matthew 22, the palace was still asleep when the Magi prepared to depart. The caravan, silent and swift, moved under the dark mantle of the early dawn. None of Herod's servants noticed. No guard dared suspect everything was under control, or so Herod thought. The Magi had left Jerusalem for Bethlehem the previous afternoon, taking with them only a few trusted servants. Herod expected them to return soon, bringing detailed information about the child. He had ordered spies to follow them, but the reports from the previous night were vague. The Magi had disappeared into the hills, and no one knew for sure what they had found. Herod spent the night wide awake. Mariam remained silent in the adjoining room, ignoring his presence as always. The king paced back and forth, waiting at any moment to hear the footsteps of the Magi returning to the palace. But the hours passed, and they did not return. When the first ray of sunlight crossed the windows, one of the soldiers hurried into the throne room, pale as death. "They're gone, my king. They left during the night." Herod turned slowly, his eyes burning with rage. "Where to?" The soldier lowered his head, trembling. "No one knows. They vanished without a trace." Herod slammed his fist on the armrest of the throne so hard that the wood cracked. The counselors stepped back, fearing they might be next to feel the king's fury. He needed no further explanations. He knew what had happened. The Magi had deceived him. While Herod erupted in fury somewhere far off in the hills of Judea, the Magi hurried on their journey back to the east, carrying in their hearts a certainty that would change the destiny of the world. The night before, each of them had been visited in dreams. Not a common vision, not a nightmare or illusion. They had felt as if heaven itself was shouting inside their minds. "Do not return to Herod, leave by another route." The oldest among them awoke first, sweating and pale. He looked around the tent and realized the others were waking the same way, their eyes wide, their faces ashen. Without saying a word, they all knew what they had to do. They knew Herod had no intention of worshipping the child. They knew he plotted death and destruction. And even without fully understanding the depth of the promise they had followed for so many days, they obeyed the voice from heaven. They gathered their camels, their tents, their treasures, and departed without saying goodbye. They avoided the main routes, steered clear of villages, and disappeared along the least guarded paths, carrying with them the secret of their encounter with the true king. Back at the palace, Herod staggered with rage. He had been betrayed, deceived, manipulated by foreigners who had mocked his authority. The king screamed for his men, ordering the spies to be punished for their failure. He commanded the borders to be reinforced, soldiers to be deployed throughout Judea. But none of this erased the fact that he had lost his only chance to locate the child before it was too late. Herod collapsed onto the throne like a defeated man. But his mind never stopped working. If the Magi had deceived him, he would find another way. He knew where the child had been born, Bethlehem. He knew the approximate time when the star had appeared months ago. He didn't need the child's name. He didn't need the exact house. All he needed was to give an order that would make Jerusalem tremble. And this time there would be no mercy. The betrayed king who planned his revenge. The early dawn gave way to an oppressive silence in Herod's palace. But unlike the city that seemed to rest, the king could not find rest for a single second. The Magi's betrayal had become a crushing weight on his chest. It wasn't just a political affront. It was a blow to his honor, his dominion, his very soul. Herod had allowed himself to be deceived. He, the cunning king, the cold strategist, had been manipulated by foreigners who spoke of stars and prophecies, and now they had vanished, disappeared like sand in the wind, leaving no trace, failing to fulfill what they had promised. But what burned most within him was not the Magi's escape. It was the feeling that once again heaven was playing against him. He paced through the dark chambers, murmuring to himself like a man possessed by his own thoughts. The sound of his sandals on the floor echoed like the footsteps of a condemned man. He spoke to no one. He sought no counsel. He allowed no one, not even his closest guards, to touch him. The walls seemed to close in around him, and every step, every shadow, every whisper in his mind drew him closer to the abyss. Herod entered the room where he kept his maps and records. He spread the scrolls out on the table and ran his hands through his hair, trying to find a way out. But all he saw were roads that led nowhere. Bethlehem was there, small, insignificant, but now cursed in his eyes. He knew the child had been there, or at least had been born there. The problem was not knowing who he was, where he was, or who might be hiding him. But there was a solution, one he preferred not to use, one that even Rome might consider brutal. Herod closed his eyes for a moment. Images began to form in his mind. Mothers weeping, children torn from their arms, soldiers invading homes, cries of despair echoing through the alleys of Bethlehem. He took a deep breath. The decision was already made, though his heart tried to resist for a brief moment. He knew what needed to be done. He secretly summoned his most loyal officers, not the ones who sought to impress Rome, not the ones who feared the people, but the ones who had already proven they had no hesitation in staining their hands with blood. They entered in silence like ghosts bowing before the king. Herod walked up to them, stopping so close he could almost feel the heavy breath of each man. "Bethlehem," he began, his voice low as a death whisper. "Every boy, every child, up to 2 years old, none must survive." The officers exchanged glances, shocked, but none dared question him. They had seen what happened to those who disobeyed. Herod continued, "Leave no trace. Do what must be done. Do not bring me glory. Bring me silence." The order was given, and the silence that filled the room at that moment was more cruel than any battle cry. But Herod knew this decision would come at a price. He knew the people would not forget. He knew the walls of Jerusalem would whisper about that massacre for generations. He knew the priests would accuse him in the corridors, even if in silence. And above all, he knew that by doing this he would seal his name as a king hated not only by men but by heaven itself. But he would not back down. As he left the room, he walked to the palace balcony. The sky was clear, starry, silent. The same star still shone in the distance over Bethlehem, as if mocking him one last time. Herod clenched his fists, bit his lip, and murmured, "If heaven has declared war on me, then let the final battle come, and that very night, the soldiers marched in secret, the cruel order that marked his story forever. Matthew 2:16. The sky seemed to have fallen silent over Bethlehem. That dawn, there was no wind, no birdsong, no sound of the carts that usually pass through the city's narrow streets. It was as if all creation was holding its breath in the face of what was about to happen. The mothers slept with their children in their arms, innocent, unaware of the sentence that had already been signed in the corridors of Jerusalem. The fathers, weary from their daily labor, dreamed of an ordinary morning, but this would not be a morning like any other. From Jerusalem, the soldiers marched in silence. There were no drums, no raised banners, no shouts of command. Only the sound of heavy sandals on the stone ground and the faint creaking of swords being sharpened. Herod remained in the palace alone, staring at the map of Bethlehem spread out on the table like a general watching the advance of an invisible army he himself had sent. He knew the city had no walls, no army, no defense. It was a vulnerable village forgotten by the great rulers of the kingdom. Until that night, when the first soldiers arrived, the sun had not yet risen. They stormed into the houses without warning, without permission, without mercy. The mothers awoke, startled by the noise of doors being broken down. The fathers tried to fight back, but were struck down like leaves in the wind. The first scream echoed in the darkness, breaking the silence of the night like a blade piercing the city's heart. And from that moment on, horror spread. The soldiers did not ask for names. They were not searching for a specific face. Any boy up to 2 years old was torn from his mother's arms like spoils of war. The cries of the children mixed with the screams of the women. Men tried to protect their sons, but were struck down with brutal force. Bethlehem turned into a valley of tears. The soldiers, ruthless, carried out each order with surgical precision, house after house, block after block. No child was spared. No family escaped a tragedy. The elders, powerless, fell to their knees in the squares, covering their heads with ashes, crying out to the heavens that seemed to have gone silent. The mothers, desperate, tore their clothes, beat their chests, pulled out their hair trying to wake from a nightmare that was all too real. Far away in the hills, no one knew that a child had already escaped. No one knew that Joseph, warned in a dream, had fled during the night, taking Mary and the child called Jesus with him before Herod's sword could reach them. But in Bethlehem, no one knew that. For them it felt as though heaven had abandoned the city. In Jerusalem, Herod listened to the cold reports from the soldiers returning with eyes empty of emotion. The king asked no questions. He gave no praise. He offered no reward. He simply waved his hand for them to leave and left himself alone in the throne room. He stood slowly, walked to the balcony, and looked up at the sky once more. The star that had shone over Bethlehem now seemed to have disappeared. Had he won for a moment, Herod believed so that he had erased any threat to his throne, that he had silenced heaven. But something in his chest told him otherwise, an emptiness that not even the spilled blood could fill, a silence that seemed to mock every conquest, as if heaven was still waiting for something greater. He knew the people would never forgive him. He knew that on that day he had sealed his name as the cruelest of kings. But to Herod that hardly mattered. What mattered was that the child was dead, or at least so he believed. The massacre. Even Rome dared not mention. The palace doors remained closed for days after the massacre. No messenger was received, no audience was granted, no festivities took place. The palace, which once overflowed with celebrations, dances, and political disputes, was now plunged into a silence heavier than the air itself. Inside, Herod locked himself in his darkest chamber. He received neither generals nor priests nor his allies from Rome. The only sounds breaking the silence were the heavy footsteps of his guards and the crackling of torches on the walls. Herod shut himself away with his maps, trying to convince himself that what he had done was necessary. Every boy killed in Bethlehem, every tear shed, every family destroyed. He told himself it was the price of keeping the throne, of protecting the power that Rome had entrusted to him. But even the Romans seemed silent about what had happened. No message of approval arrived from the capital. No recognition was sent from Caesar Augustus. Nothing, as if Rome, always eager to control the provinces with an iron fist, now preferred to pretend that nothing had happened. Herod knew why. Even for Rome, there were limits that once crossed inspired more fear than admiration. Bethlehem had become a forbidden whisper in the palace corridors. Not even the soldiers dared to speak of it. Those who had participated in the slaughter returned mute with empty eyes, as if they had left their souls in that cursed village. The days passed, but the smell of death seemed to follow Herod everywhere. He tried to occupy his mind, but the faces of the children, the mothers, the screams haunted his nights like endless nightmares. In the throne room, he tried to maintain the appearance of an absolute king. He received ambassadors from other lands, signed decrees, ordered the city walls to be restored, but no one could ignore the shadow hanging over Jerusalem. The priests who once bowed so easily now kept their heads low, their eyes avoiding the king's gaze. The elders murmured under their breath, but none dared confront him. The people walked silently through the streets, afraid even of the walls. The city seemed cursed. Miriam, his wife, avoided him even more. Her gaze, once filled with disdain, now carried something worse, revulsion. She did not utter a single word in his presence. She didn't have to. Her silence was a judgment from which the king could not escape. Herod began to feel the weight of every decision, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he had won, something deep inside told him that victory was an illusion. On a cold night, he rose from his bed, unable to sleep once again. He walked alone to the highest terrace of the palace and looked out over the dark vastness beyond the walls. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine the voice of the people, but the silence was deafening. Then, like a defeated man, Herod fell to his knees on the cold stones, clenched his fists, and whispered, "Why? Why do I still feel no peace?" He waited for heaven to answer. He waited for a sign, anything, but heaven remained silent, and Herod, for the first time in many years, felt fear. Not fear of men, not fear of Rome, but fear of something greater. Fear that even with all the blood that had been shed, he had still failed, the disease that consumed his bowels. The days grew longer in Jerusalem, but time seemed to stand still inside the palace. Herod the Great, the king who had once been feared throughout Judea, now fought against an enemy that no sword could defeat, his own flesh. The first pains began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a cramp in his stomach, a discomfort in his joints, a fever that came and went. Herod ignored the signs, as he always did with anything that threatened his position. But the disease was patient. It consumed him from within slowly, like a fire hidden beneath the embers. As the weeks passed, Herod's body began to give way. The man who once strode through the palace with the grandeur of a king now limped through the halls, leaning against the walls and hiding his weakness under heavy robes. His eyes lost their brightness, his skin darkened with purplish spots, and the fever became more constant with each passing day. The court physicians were summoned in haste, but none of them had answers. They whispered among themselves as if afraid to speak the truth aloud. Herod heard them from the shadows, catching every word, choked by fear. "It is an illness in the bowels. We have no cure," they murmured. The king pretended not to hear. He ordered everyone to leave and locked himself alone in his chambers, but his body no longer obeyed as before. The pain dominated him day and night, the blood that secretly flowed, the wounds that would not heal, the muffled groans so the people wouldn't know their king was falling. Rumors began to spread through the streets of Jerusalem. The people spoke of plagues, of divine judgment, of a curse for the innocent blood spilled in Bethlehem. No one dared say it in public, but in homes, in alleys, and in synagogues, the city was already burying the king before seeing him die. Herod, however, refused to accept it. Even while ill, he continued giving orders. He commanded the execution of servants who showed him pity. He tortured soldiers who dared to speak of his weakness. He tried to prove that he was still in control, but the days betrayed him. The stench of sickness filled the corridors. Mariam, once silent, now withdrew completely. His sons, raised under fear, began to probe among themselves who would be the next to inherit the throne. The palace had become a nest of vultures, each one waiting for the king's final breath. Herod knew it. He saw the glances, he felt the venom of unspoken words. He had built an empire on fear, and now, surrounded by his own creations, he tasted the bitter flavor of loneliness. One night, unable to bear the pain, Herod summoned a young servant, a boy he knew had no ambition or political connections. When the boy approached, trembling, the king spoke in a broken voice. "Do the people still fear me?" The servant, frightened, hesitated, but seeing the tears in the king's eyes, he realized this wasn't a test, it was a dying man. Seeking redemption, the boy lowered his head and replied, "The people are only waiting for you to die." Herod closed his eyes. The answer was crueler than any sword in his back. He dismissed the servant with a wave and remained alone, staring at the shadow of his own reflection on the cold floor of the chamber. The king who had once challenged heaven, now challenged death, and for the first time in his life he knew he would lose the bitter end of the one who tried to kill the anointed one. Matthew 2:19. The palace had become a fortress of silence and fear. The smell of Herod's disease spread through the walls like an inevitable omen. The servants crept through the corridors like shadows. The physicians were no longer called, for there was nothing they could do. The king was dying, and everyone knew it. Jerusalem knew it too. The entire city held its breath, waiting for the news that seemed to take longer than expected. But within the palace halls, Herod lingered. He clung to life like a man who refuses to let go of the throne, even when death is already seated beside him. Mariam had vanished from his sight weeks ago. His sons conspired in secret. No friends remained. No allies showed loyalty. The man who had ruled with an iron fist was now nothing more than a weakened body, bent by pain, lying in a bed that seemed more like a premature tomb. In his final hours, Herod raved. He whispered the names of enemies, long dead, relived battles he had won, called for soldiers who had long since returned to dust. But what he murmured most in the midst of his feverish delirium was the name he had never dared to say aloud. The king, the child, the Messiah. The words slipped from his lips like a curse, like a forbidden name he feared to hear even at the moment of death. Though he had ordered the massacre of Bethlehem, something inside him told him he had failed, that the child had escaped, that the promise was still alive somewhere. His eyes, now clouded, seemed to see beyond the walls, as if they beheld the distant hills, the caravans in the desert, the people who still awaited the deliverer. The fear that had consumed him for years now seemed to mock him. The spilled blood, the hidden crimes, the crafted betrayals, all blended in his mind like a river flowing toward a single destiny: death. That morning the guards received their final order. Herod, already unable to speak clearly, made one last gesture with his hand, as if releasing everything he had tried to hold on to for so long. His body trembled, but his soul seemed already gone. The counselors approached the bed, watching in silence. None dared to weep. None dared to come too close. The king was passing, and with him an entire era of fear and terror. When the last breath escaped his lips, the room remained in absolute silence. It was the end, but even dead, Herod left a shadow that lingered over Judea. At that very moment, far away in the land of Egypt, a man awoke from a dream. Joseph the carpenter, the man who had fled from Bethlehem with his wife and child, woke in the middle of the night with a divine revelation. The angel who had once told him to flee now appeared again. "Rise, take the child and his mother, and return to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." Joseph opened his eyes with tears. The fear that had pursued him for so long now seemed to vanish. The king was dead. The way was clear. The child had survived. Before we continue, an important reminder. Your subscription to the channel, your like and sharing this video are essential ways to keep this project alive. Let's return to where the story left us. The return of the Holy Family, blocked by Archelaus, Matthew 2:22. Herod's body had not yet cooled completely when his sons began to fight among themselves for what remained of the kingdom. The palace of Jerusalem, once silent, now boiled with secret meetings, broken alliances, and veiled threats. Rome, informed of the king's death, soon sent representatives to oversee the transition. But Herod's sons had already anticipated every move. Among them, Archelaus proved to be the most ambitious. He declared himself the principal heir, claiming for himself the title his father had defended with blood. Archelaus had inherited not only the throne, but also the terror surrounding Herod's name. The people, still mourning the children of Bethlehem, saw in the successor nothing more than an extension of the nightmare that seemed to have no end. While Jerusalem burned with whispers and fears, the Holy Family began their journey back, leaving Egypt as had been revealed to Joseph in a dream. Obediently, he guided Mary and the child Jesus along routes known only to merchants and pilgrims, trying to avoid curious eyes that might expose them. Joseph's heart was torn. He knew God had spoken. He knew the cruel king had died. But something in his spirit still found no peace. The road felt heavy, as if every step was watched by invisible eyes. As they approached the borders of Judea, Joseph heard the news spreading through the caravans. Herod's son now rules. Archelaus has taken the throne. Fear returned like a knife twisting in an open wound. Joseph stopped by the roadside, looked at Mary, and in silence let his tears reveal his anguish. The angel had never said it would be easy. He had only said to return that night. While the child slept beneath Mary's cloak, Joseph prayed in silence. He asked for direction, for peace, for safety, for his family. And once again, God answered in a dream. The angel appeared for the third time, and his message was as clear as the morning light. "Do not go back to Judea. Go to Galilee." Joseph awoke with his heart racing. He woke Mary, took the child in his arms, and without wasting any time, changed the direction of their journey. He left the road that led to Jerusalem, and took the path to Galilee to a city called Nazareth. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Archelaus began to show the people that he had inherited not only the title but also the tyranny of his father. He ordered the execution of religious leaders, suppressed protests, and crushed any movement that threatened his rule. The people already knew nothing had changed. Rome, seeing the instability of the heir, hesitated to grant him the full title of king. Archelaus ruled as a puppet, sustained by threats and brutality. Fear had changed its name, but it still haunted the streets of Jerusalem. Joseph, now in Nazareth, watched the child grow up far from the shadow of Herod's throne and his son. The Messiah was safe for now. Herod was dead, but the spirit of fear remained alive, embodied in his heir. Yet the prophecy was not forgotten, and soon Israel would discover that the true king was already walking among them, not in Jerusalem, but in Nazareth. The terror that continued under Herod's son. Herod's body had been buried for months, but for the people the king's death had brought no relief. On the contrary, it seemed that terror had only changed its face. Archelaus, son of Herod, now sat on the throne. His father had left behind. Young yet already corrupted by the palace's intrigues, he presented himself to the people with promises of continuity, not of peace, not of hope, but of absolute domination. Judea had hoped for change. Many believed that with Herod's death, perhaps Rome would send a new governor, someone less violent, someone who might at least listen to the people's cries. But that is not what happened. The young Archelaus had already learned everything from his father. He had learned to crush revolts before they could ignite, to silence voices before they gained strength, to crush any hope before it became a threat. In the early days of his rule, he ordered hundreds to be killed during the Passover feast. Priests who dared confront him were imprisoned. Young people who spoke of liberation disappeared. Entire families began fleeing Judea, seeking refuge in neighboring regions. Rome, watching from afar, hesitated. The governors knew Archelaus lacked his father's charisma and the political skill necessary to control such an unstable province, yet for the moment, they allowed him to rule. Rome needed someone to keep the people under control, and Archelaus did that, even if by force. Inside the palace, the corridors that had once witnessed Herod's cruel reign now watched the steps of an insecure son, haunted by the legacy he had inherited. Archelaus knew he was not respected like his father. He knew the people feared him, but not enough to keep him safe for long. He heard the rumors, whispers about a child who had escaped the massacre, stories of a new king, a descendant of David, growing up in secret. Archelaus tried to ignore these voices, but the same fear that had corrupted his father now began to take hold of his own heart. The streets of Jerusalem were emptier. Merchants closed early. Women walked with their heads down. The synagogues, once filled with prayers and songs, now echoed with silent laments. The people lived as if carrying an invisible burden, as if walking through a valley with no horizon. In Nazareth, far from Jerusalem's oppression, the Holy Family blended in with peasants and craftsmen. Joseph worked in silence, supporting his home with the sweat of his callous hands. Mary cared for the child who grew in stature and grace far from the eyes that had pursued him since birth. But in Jerusalem no one knew that. The elders still debated in the squares. Some believed the true king had died in the massacre. Others whispered that the promise still lived somewhere. The older ones, however, seemed to have lost all hope. They saw Archelaus ruling with an iron fist, Rome silent in the face of injustice. And the heavens seemed quieter than ever. The people no longer spoke of the Messiah with expectation, but with weariness. It was as if the promise had become a burden, as if the next generations had learned to survive without hoping for anything more. Hope had become a luxury that few could afford. And while the throne of Jerusalem remained occupied by an air of fear far away, the true king was growing hidden from the eyes of a world that no longer expected to be saved, when even Rome fell silent about his name. The years began to pass, and with them the name of Herod was mentioned less and less in the palace corridors. The people, though still wounded by the memory of the massacre of Bethlehem, no longer spoke his name as before. Herod's sons tried to keep the dynasty alive, but the weight of the past began to suffocate them. Rome, for its part, seemed to lose interest in the figure once called the King of the Jews. The Senate, which had once acclaimed Herod with pomp and honor, now barely mentioned his name in official records. To Caesar's men, Herod had fulfilled his role. He had kept Judea under submission for decades, but dead, he had become nothing more than an uncomfortable shadow, a memory of a ruler who had taken terror to the extreme. What remained of the empire Herod had built began to collapse. The cities he had adorned with marble and gold now suffered decay. The fortresses he had raised with an iron hand began to fall into the hands of rebellious Jews. The aqueducts, once symbols of power, were overtaken by abandonment. Archelaus, unable to maintain absolute control like his father, ruled under Rome's suspicion. His brothers, in different regions, fought over what was left of the kingdom. The dynasty Herod had built by force through alliances, marriages, and blood began to crumble like a sandcastle before the tide. The people no longer even spoke of the king. The name of Herod had become a ghost. The elders mentioned only as a curse. The mothers who had once wept for their children in Bethlehem now taught the new generations to forget that name, not out of forgiveness, but because even remembering seemed to reopen the wound. Herod the Great, the king who once challenged heaven, was now nothing but a bitter memory. In Rome, the silence about him was strategic. The senators knew that keeping the memory of a tyrant alive could ignite rebellions in the provinces. It was better to erase the name, erase the statues, erase the honors, pretend that Herod had never been as important as he once believed. In the Temple of Jerusalem, which he had proudly ordered to be renovated, the priests continued their ceremonies, but none dared to give thanks for those stones. The people knew that the gold shining on the temple walls had been stained with the blood of the innocent. Herod's memory was engraved there like an open wound. Archelaus, increasingly unstable, knew he ruled on the edge of collapse. He tried in vain to maintain the illusion of control, but his own people were already whispering to Rome, asking for intervention, and Rome, tired of the intrigues of the Herodian dynasty, began to plan his replacement. Meanwhile, far from the walls of the capital in Nazareth of Galilee, the true heir of David was growing in silence. Jesus, the child who had escaped Herod's sword, now walked among the simple, learning the trade of a carpenter. Far from the thrones, far from the threats, far from the eyes of history, the child Herod had tried to destroy was still alive. And Herod's name continued to die day after day, forgotten even by those who once feared him. The birth of John the Baptist during the reign of Herod, Luke 1-5. Before Herod's shadow began to fall over Bethlehem, before the Magi arrived from the east, before Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt, something extraordinary was already being quietly woven in the hills of Judea. In the days of Herod, a priest named Zechariah served in the temple. He belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was a descendant of Aaron, the oldest priestly lineage in Israel. Both were righteous in God's eyes, blameless in their ways, but they carried a silent sorrow that had weighed on them for years. They had no children, and their youth had already passed. While Herod schemed alliances and murders in the palace corridors, while he crafted his image as the king Rome had placed over Israel, God was quietly preparing a scene no one suspected. One day, Zechariah was chosen by lot to burn incense in the holy place of the temple. It was a rare honor, likely the only time in his life he would have such a privilege. The people stood outside in prayer while he entered alone into the presence of God. While Herod surrounded himself with soldiers and spies, Zechariah entered unarmed, dressed only in his priestly robes before the altar of prayer. And then the impossible happened. An angel of the Lord appeared beside the altar. Zechariah, overwhelmed with fear, fell to the ground. But the angel spoke with a voice that shattered centuries of silence. "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to name him John." The old priest could hardly believe it. The angel continued, "He will be great before the Lord. He must not drink wine or strong drink. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring many of the people of Israel back to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah hesitated to believe, and because of this, he was struck mute until the day the child was born. But what had been promised came to pass. Elizabeth, already advanced in age, conceived, and in the hills of Judea, while the people still spoke of the terror of Herod's reign, a new hope began to grow. John was born far from the courts, far from the walls, far from the throne's disputes, but his life would become a turning point. He would be the voice crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way for the Messiah, whom Herod had so feared. While the king clung to power, God raised up a child to announce the true king who was coming. John the Baptist was born as the herald of what Herod could never prevent, and all of this happened during the reign of the man who believed he controlled Israel. The end of the dynasty that tried to stop the Messiah. Time moved forward like a river that never stops. Decades had passed since Herod had died, surrounded by fear, power, and loneliness. Jerusalem had seen kings and governors come and go. Rome, still sovereign, kept Judea under its iron grip. But the people no longer spoke of Herod, the name that once echoed through the palace corridors, that inspired fear in every home, that stained Bethlehem with innocent blood, had now become nothing more than a distant shadow in Israel's memory. Herod the Great had become the forgotten king, an empty throne, a dynasty corroded by internal disputes, assassinations between brothers, and broken alliances. His sons had been deposed one by one. His lineage, torn apart by ambition and betrayal, did not survive. Archelaus, who ruled for only a few years after his father's death, was deposed by Rome and exiled. Other descendants fought over small territories, but none ever managed to restore the dominion Herod once boasted. The empire he built crumbled before the very eyes of his heirs. The fear he spread, instead of preserving his power, only hastened the end of what he had sworn to protect, and the child he had tried to kill survived. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, far from the throne's eyes, far from the throne's eyes, far from the swords that had once sought his life. He grew up as a common man in the eyes of the people, but he carried within him an eternal promise. Herod, with all his strength and cruelty, had failed to stop God's plan. The Messiah walked among men. He touched lepers, gave sight to the blind, raised the dead, proclaimed a kingdom that was not of this world. And when the time came, he entered Jerusalem, not as a king in a war chariot, but riding on a donkey, while the people spread palm branches and shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Herod was dead, but the true Son of David had arrived. Herod's iron throne had crumbled, but the eternal throne was being revealed before Israel's eyes in heaven. The heaven that Herod had tried to challenge now opened over the Lamb who would be slain for the sins of the world. Herod tried to stop the promise, but all he managed to do was become the forgotten villain in a story that would end not with human crowns, but with a risen king seated at the right hand of God. The king who challenged heaven lost to eternity, and his name was erased from the people's hope, while the name of Jesus continues to echo through the centuries, challenging kingdoms, rulers, and hearts to this day. Thank you so much for following us this far. It is a great joy to be able to share these stories with you. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share it with those who also value this kind of material. We'll see you in the next video. Until then.